Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Michael and Teresa, for these exceptional presentations that made us think across two different realms between the political and the cinematic, and led me to think about the temporalities that exist between a concrete existence and an existence of the imaginary. It's difficult to concentrate with. Thank you. And I would start by, we don't have a lot of time to questions also because we want the audience to have time to dialogue with you and ask you anything eventually. And I will start with a question for the three, which is something that crossed my mind through the different presentations, and it's quite general, and touches what you, Teresa, were referring about, the relation with anthropomorphism, that somehow it led me to wonder if anthropomorphism... Oh.
Sorry, that's my son.
Oh, maybe he wants to come on stage. And when you were talking about anthropomorphism, and of course, Michael, you were referring to different morphological configurations that we could understand and think and learn from plants. It led me to think I would like to know your thoughts on this, if instead of seeing anthropomorphism as a human-centric vice, a gesture, a propensity that we humans have to reduce different life forms to our own systems of operation and our systems of existence, couldn't it be a limit in the sense that we can only understand what we render, and render also in the terms of a cinematic rendering or of a political rendering, into a shape, a behavior, a system that we comprehend, let's say?
Well, you're the philosopher.
Well, yes, so this question of anthropomorphism is quite crucial, I think, especially because we cannot presuppose that the meaning of anthropos, of the human, is somehow fixed and determinate, right? There would not have existed the whole philosophical way of thinking were we sure what the anthropos was. And a very stark contrast for me is what happened in the 20th century and what is happening now in the 21st. In the 20th century, with existentialism, the human was an open question. So it was a kind of the figure of indeterminacy itself. So what would it mean to say that one is anthropocentric? At the center of it all would be a certain indeterminacy, a vacuum, right? Now in the 21st century, with the Anthropocene, and we might debate the usefulness of the term or the extent to which it is justifiable, but nonetheless, the anthropos is right there in the word Anthropocene. We have the exact opposite. So the anthropos has become an answer without a question, right? If in existentialism, the human was a question without a final determinate answer, now we're shifting to a kind of strange situation where the human is an answer without a question. It's the remnants of industrial activity stored in the geological strata. The vegetality of anthropocentrism might be also a trick that this kind of way of shifting meanings play on us. So if we go back again to Aristotle, for Aristotle, he would say various things that define the human as a human, right? The human is an animal who can speak, or the political animal. But he would also say that the human is the most mimetic of all creatures. The most mimetic, this is what defines the anthropos, according to at least one of his definitions. That means that the anthropos is a creature who can imitate, who can take the place of all other creatures in the best, in the most efficient way. And so that, for me, is a kind of an attempt to define the human vegetally through a kind of mutability, through a shape-shifting, through a shape that is not congealed, that is not frozen. So even in these kinds of violent appropriatory gestures of classical philosophy, there is a potential. I think we need to question what exactly we place in the center of the anthropocentrism. And that's where I see the role of philosophy, really.
Yeah, well, I will probably repeat myself, but my point is that one should distinguish between anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism, and that I mean, I really cannot see how can we avoid language is anthropomorphic. How can we get rid of language? I mean, so this is why I was talking about a sort of critical and naive anthropomorphism. But I think we can actually progressively decenter the centrality of the human, and so challenge the very notion of anthropocentrism, and to try to go beyond, somewhere beyond the human. So I'm actually repeating myself, but I agree with you. I think philosophy has a role to play, anthropology has a role to play, of course, as the science of man and of anthropos. And it's interesting, I mean, I'm more familiar maybe with, I'm not an anthropologist, but I do read a lot of anthropology, and this is one of the one of the missions that certain anthropologists like Natasha Myers are giving themselves today is actually to try and take, anthropology beyond the human. And I found it interesting, just to go back also to Natasha's presentation, that she was not talking about becoming vegetal or becoming plant, because honestly it's going to be very difficult, but to make coalitions. And of course, as you are saying, to think about humans and politics and whatever, the world, in vegetal terms. So this is part of the process of, this is very difficult to say in every language, but to de-anthropocenter, to uncenter the anthropos.
Yes, and if I could add very briefly something to this particular point, I think that this is not even a new solution that we should be looking for, but rather something that has been very deeply repressed and that is already in us. And so for me, it is the work of what Plato calls the anamnesis, a kind of unforgetting, the unforgetting of the vegetal in us, or of our vegetality as well. It's a kind of more of a turn to a deep past than even to an indeterminate future, in a sense, this work of de-anthropomorphizing. Yeah.
So we're going to try and keep our questions quite brief, because we don't have a lot of time for this panel and we want to open it up to you. But certainly interventions such as Natasha, or offerings such as Tabitha's, bring in the question of, I guess, practice or ritual. The last time we did a shape of a circle in the mind of a fish, Phoebe Tickell did a meditation on, a sort of guided meditation on symbiosis. And so I was thinking about this sort of technology and ritual kind of, I guess, dichotomy, but not quite. So it feels to me like the relationship with plant has as much to do with technology, with the way that it's mediated, film, polygraph, whatever, as it might do with ritual, ways that and in that sense, ways that it might be consumed. And that then led me to think about, Michael, your presentation in terms of like, well, what is then the political ritual within this realm of the vegetal protest? But then, Kim, returning to the presentation that this morning you did together with Kapani and with Miranda, I was also thinking about the relationship between the vegetal protest, which is the term that Michael used in the talk, and the vegetal as protest, meaning the seed that is consumed to obtain an abortion, and so on. And so between these two layers, it's because I'm trying to squish two questions in one. Between these two layers of the kind of physical reality of the vegetal as protest, as a kind of imbued or consumed thing, the ritualistic or somehow practice-based relationship of incorporating the vegetal, and the kind of metaphors-ish that we use to discuss certain things such as ritual or such as politics as vegetal. Yeah. Question. Sorry. Should I try again? No.
You want to ask questions? So you're talking about, so I'm a plant scientist, I work on medicinal plants, I'm not a philosopher or an anthropologist, but it's interesting what you say about the act of ritual with plants. So I work a lot in education with people about how plants were used in the past by people, and in a practical way, if you do it, you make the things in the way that people used to make them, in a ritualistic way, whether it's just connecting with the plants in a very practical way, rather than a theoretical way, it brings an extra level of knowledge about how plants are used, particularly about if you how things were moved and used and consumed as well. Not just reading about them, but trying things out themselves. And I'm not talking about any of the poisons we talked about, but maybe more things like about food or plants that were used for wellness.
Well, at the level of ritual, I think maybe it's a different level of political subjectivity that would be involved there, because most of my talk was concerned with the vegetal movements that are either infra-individual or supra-individual. So they are so large, the decaying, the growing, the metamorphosis, they move almost below and above the thresholds that rituals would usually admit. And so for me, it's a very difficult question, and how do we fit those kinds of large-scale and at the same time almost microscopic movements within the time and space of a ritual, right? It's
So
an open question.
you would say that in a way it's not a use of the vegetable. There's a text that you wrote about sort of speaking for plants, speaking on behalf of plants, and you wouldn't really necessarily describe it as like a metaphorical use of the idea of a plant
No,
at
no.
all, but more like a different.
Yes, exactly. It
scale
is not at all metaphorical, and in fact,
Yes.
we've had a number of these discussions earlier today. I resist in much of my work the very divide between the literal and the metaphorical meanings. So I work, as it were, my work spans that divide in the sense that it's neither literal nor metaphorical. But these sorts of movements are like in film, where the time scale can shift simply thanks to certain technical, certain techniques like time-lapse photography. So in our perspective on politics, the time-space of politics can shift, and we can see really the growth and decay of certain political forms like the state, the empire, and so on, along the line of these vegetal movements. So for me, it is not at all a metaphor, but really a different way of viewing an actual material development thanks to this technology of thinking, maybe, right? There is not really a time-lapse photography in thought going on, but thanks to a change in perspective on it.
Before handing the microphone to the audience, I had a question which concerns actually, or most likely, the reason why we are here and the reason why plant studies are becoming once more beyond the metaphorical and going to the concrete, a growing field of research. And I wonder if you had some thoughts in relation to the possible reasons for this growth of interest, of passion, of curiosity for plants. Somehow, I mean, being using a botanical figure, being rooted in animal studies, I somehow find very useful the ideas of great John Berger on the fact that the growth of interest in animals comes from a system of mourning the animals because we lost the relation with these. Our daily encounter is not populated by an encounter with other animal presences, and therefore we long for them, both brought as haunted figures through cinema or concretely by spaces like the zoo and so on and so forth. And I wonder, what are your thoughts in relation to this current interest and this current growth for critical plant studies and for plant systems of imaginary also to emerge?
Me to start. So I'm thinking aloud because it's difficult to answer that question properly. Well, as I was saying, I think what I prefer to call the capitalocene instead of the Anthropocene, because this really is a problem of capitalism and, you know, just destroying the natural resources of the planet. I think it plays, I mean, this is one of the major elements that should be taken into account, and the way that we are actually looking more and more and turning our attention to all the meaningful others with whom we share the planet, and yes, that are threatened from extinction, disappearance, etc. So this is a very sort of vague context, a very wide context for this. I mean, plants are, it's not only about the plants as I've shown you in films, it's also about vegetal entities such as the forest. I mean, the forest is also a political entity. As you were saying earlier on, I mean, forests are not just made of trees, they're made of alliances between very different types of beings. And historically also, the forests were outside the polis, a space of freedom, of resistance. Anyway, so I think that sometimes also these much larger vegetal entities are sort of inspiring us to rethink also about new ways of imagining what it is to be in the world with others, and to imagine a new sort of politics. If you think about, if I go back to the French context, and I think about the zones autonomes à défendre, so the spaces that have been occupied, like forests and places that in particular are threatened because of the possible construction of airports, but that become sort of spaces where people try to think about alternative political systems. I think there's the vegetal is a way of unthinking, as you were saying, and rethinking things. And then you see the upsurge of lots of witchcraft, the use of, well, what we associate with witchcraft and magic, but you know, the sort of distancing from very scientifical, authoritative, normative in all senses, answers and techniques, the way that we turn more and more to for instance, for plants as medicine, as a way of, I don't know, of living better your menopause. I mean, these are important questions, and they are also related to gender. I mean, so I think this is part of this very large, complex crisis that we are experiencing in both, let's say, human and political terms.
Kim, just that same question to you. There's a kind of extractivism that transforms herbal or plant or vegetable-based kind of compounds, or synthesizes it and then turns them into a product that is so separated from the plant life, seeming that nobody is sort of, nobody who receives them as a pill or whatever is in a position of going, oh, I could make this, or I could sort of go forward to this and create this. Do you find this in your research when you turn the historical gaze towards the plant, like when you follow the plant, do you find that there's this kind of cut between the use of plants and the kind of synthesis and current, I suppose, pharmacological?
There's an interesting, everything's always changing, everything turns back on itself. So with the rise of synthetic medicines, lots of medicines, even today in the top prescribed medicines, many of them will have come from plants, compounds, and either synthesized or still come from plants. Examples are willow, from aspirin from willow, or morphine from poppies. But what's interesting is this interesting idea about, in herbal medicine, in traditional medicines, it's not just about one compound, it's about a synthesis of things that are greater than the sum of its parts. And in medicine, quite, understandably, you want this kind of magic bullet. You have a problem, you need something to sort it. But as research is going now, people are starting to understand that in medicine, perhaps it isn't just one thing. It's a complex of things. We're all complex things. We're full of receptors. And perhaps with plants, it isn't about finding and extracting and isolating this one compound, but perhaps a little bit more than that, having a look at how things interact with each other. And that's an interesting trend in medicine, which still also needs to iron out things about if you use a plant for medicine, how do you patent it? Because research is expensive. Should it be patented? If you get a plant from a community, who has the intellectual property? Who gets paid back value for this plant? I mean, how do you pay back somebody who's in a different sphere from you? You know, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you make billions from something and you're perhaps a tribe from the Amazon, how do you bring back value and respect the intellectual property as well? And it's all about the complexity within the plant and the complexity in the culture around the plant as well.
Yeah. Do you guys have any questions? There's a couple of mics around the room, so just raise your hand. I can see. Yeah. Thank you.
How much of the interest in plants would you say have to do with drug culture, and also how much are plants related to, how much is our understanding of plants to do with our understanding of algorithms?
Wait, what?
I missed the last,
Understanding
the last little bit.
Drug culture?
Algorithms in understanding plants, the idea of understanding what is intelligence through our understanding of computers and technology, through the understanding of algorithms.
Well, yeah, this is the, as I mentioned very briefly in my talk, this is the predominant model for ontology today. It's the network, and so the prototype for intelligence is algorithmic. I do have deep respect for the work of some of my colleagues in the field of analytic philosophy interested in plants, in particular Paco Garzón from the University of Murcia, who is investigating plant intelligence precisely in these terms of algorithmic, very complex algorithms that go into decision-making, for instance, in the act of blossoming. All the variables that any plant has to, a cherry tree, for instance, has to weigh and measure before it actually blossoms. If you think algorithmically about that, it's a very, very complex algorithm, and this is what Paco is working on. But for me, there is an essential difference between intelligence on the one hand and thinking on the other. And this is why I wrote a book, Plant Thinking, and not Plant Intelligence. Because intelligence is, its framework is probably common to humans, plants, animals, and any other organisms. Intelligence is a sophisticated tool for an organism to procure what it needs from its environment. No form of life that does not have a certain kind of intelligence would be able to survive even for a day, let alone for millions of years, as plants have. But for me, thinking is something else nonetheless. It's not that I want to say that humans have a prerogative on thinking and plants do not. In fact, I think that plants think better than humans, but in a way that does not overlap with intelligence. Thinking, rather than being instrumental, is the exact opposite. Rather than seeking something for oneself, procuring resources in the best, most efficient way from the environment, is going out into the world, is existing on the edges of oneself. And what or who are plants if not these multiple edge existences, precisely turned outwards, whether through the leaves, the flowers, the roots, and so on. So for me, this is the embodied notion of thinking as existence on the edge between oneself and the other, on the edge between oneself and the environment, that cannot be reduced to these very instrumental measures that intelligence is always submitted to.
Oh, should we? Over there? There's someone behind there. It's hard to see.
There's this person with the blue shirt.
One.
Hi. You drew the analogy between decay. Sorry, it's weird to speak into this microphone. Between decay and corruption in political systems. But I was thinking about this analogy, and whereas the like переспелый or гнилой, the words in Russian actually kind of imply one another, but the processes of those, well, the kind of mechanics of the two processes are actually quite different, because corruption would imply the kind of constant sequestering of resources, maybe in a foreign account that's secret, or in some sort of infrastructure that's privatized, and then that resource doesn't go back to the community, whereas decay is sort of the redistribution of accumulated resources back into a community with the facilitation of something like a fungus or bacteria or whatever. If, in that case, I don't really see that analogy within that binary of growth versus decay in political systems, what would be an equivalent of the decomposition process in the political sphere as a kind of redistribution of resources back to the smallest units, so maybe individual people?
Yes, so thank you very much. It's a great question. And as I mentioned, this kind of political corruption is the outcome of the separation between the two movements of plants, growth and decay. So corruption is not equivalent to decay. I'm sorry if you heard me suggesting that. Rather, corruption is decay untied from growth, which is what happens. And the main tragedy that I see today is exactly this kind of unbinding of the two powers of vegetal movement, one from the other, of growth from decay. And so corruption is decay unbound from growth. And this is what it has always, corruption actually has lots of religious connotations to it. It's I'm dreaming of writing a political theology of corruption, right? Because it has always been linked to sin and to the sinfulness of the flesh itself, right? The flesh is what corrupts spirit in that sense, that what corrupts the soul. It is not even what we do, but what we are. The original sin as the highest moment of corruption, and one that cannot be expiated in a sense. And so, yes, so this is the first response to your question. Corruption is not equivalent to decay, it is decay that has been uncoupled from growth. And you're absolutely right. Once we retie growth to decay, then the complex of these movements would allow for the redistribution of a just redistribution of resources to a community, just as compost redistributes the nutrients in the soil to the plants that grow in it. And those nutrients, by the way, do not come from the outside, they come from the rotting parts of those plants themselves, right? The fruit and leaves and even trunks of dead trees that have fallen in the meanwhile. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks. I want to go back to the question of machines and technology, which were very present in all the presentations. And you can think of climate change as the result of an unlivable relationship between machines and the earth, and a reckless and destructive relation between machines and plants and other living things. But in the idea of network as the ontology of today, or in the idea of the mediated plant, you're talking about plants necessarily being thought through and being understood through machines of a certain sort. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about what kinds of machines are best to think with, or best to know with, or best to sense with when we're dealing with plants. Do you have different thoughts of different qualities of machines that are particularly plant-ready or plant-friendly, different scales of thinking about machines, or different ways of thinking about the inputs or the outputs of machines that allow you to think with plants in ways that aren't destructive and harmful?
It's a very good question, but I mean, I'm not a biologist. I mean, what I mean is that I don't get to work with plants using machines. I mean, I was speaking as a film scholar. So I'm going to give you an answer not as a film scholar, but as a sort of spectator, not a science person who works with plants and who actually uses machines to do research on plants. My presentation put a lot of emphasis on film, and obviously on visual means. It's not only that, it's also the sort of effabulation that is created around plants on film, and this is an important part of the process. This sort of magic, the magic that is, let's say, proper to the film technology is extremely important, and we shouldn't forget about this. But I would like actually to talk about sound and the idea of listening to plants. Last weekend, I was at the Museum of Natural History in Paris, and two bioacousticians, I don't know how you say this in English, were actually playing to us a number of record fieldings that they did in different forests, and where they place recording devices in either very close to the ground or on top of the forests, as we were talking before also. And the sounds are considerably different, but they give us, they give us not only a notion, another way of connecting maybe to trees and the forest and to plants and the vegetal world, but they are also a very, apparently a very efficient portray of the health of the forests in question because of the type of sound that you hear. And as a spectator, again, I found this incredibly moving. And I was with my son, who is 9, and I was very worried because I thought, oh, maybe 2 hours of field recordings from the Guyana, the French Guyana, this is going to tell me let's go outside. He absolutely loved it because it's really very again, very enthralling. And I really think, this is another debate, but there's a part of magic in film and maybe in these sort of audio experiences that magic in as much as it really impacts us humans, that is extremely important. And for what I understand, no plants or forests were hurt during these sound recordings. So this is what I can say. But again, I think this is a very good question to ask really a biologist, someone who works in a lab, someone who works with plants and who is today working on these problems of plant thinking, plant intelligence, etc. But maybe you want to...
Yeah. Sure.
Hi. Sorry, it's really bad form to say. But I also feel like in the same way that it's important to de-anthropocenter plants and animals, it's also important to de-digitalize technology, because in a sense, technology, the sort of human-made pollination of like the date palm in Mesopotamia is a technology, but it's 7,000 years old. So it's also, I also feel like when we're talking about, and this is why sort of, Kim, your sort of historical interest into technology feels to me like a continuum in a kind of history of different kinds of technologies that then aren't necessarily the machine as well, maybe. Maybe. We leave it in the maybe.
Yes, I think just one very brief point here. I think that Teresa put it in a very crisp way when she talked about the mediated plant, because what is interesting is that the plants themselves are mediators. They're mediators on many different levels, right? Not only for us, they mediate nourishment and breathable air, but they are the mediators between what is above and below, because they are the first living beings for whom this distinction is actually meaningful. They cannot grow without determining what is above and what is below. So they're the mediators between the earth and the sky, between the elements and so on, between the organic and the inorganic. And so the question becomes very complex then. Once we mediate the mediators, what are we doing? Are we doing a hypermediation, which then results in these kinds of excesses of technology and machines that the questioner is asking about? Or are we putting ourselves in the shoes or in the roots of plants somehow, right, and trying to perform their function, which has also been the problem with many of the discourses of sustainability, right? When the well-meaning discourses of sustainability said that humans should be more sustainable, it is actually a piece of hubris, because a human cannot sustain the environment, right? we are putting ourselves at the base of something that we cannot support, which is the whole ecosystem. It is the plants who are materially sustaining the world, not us. And so we have to also work and play with these concepts of mediation and mediating and the mediated in this way of seeing who is performing which function and how, to what extent are we trying to place ourselves in the place that is not proper to us somehow. Yeah.
I think we might be running out of time. Thank you so much, Kim, Michael, Teresa.
Thank you.
Thank you.